It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to you all. And I must say this meeting, I've just caught about the last three-quarters of an hour of it, reminds me of a meeting about 30 years ago at the Grosvenor House Hotel when there were no venture capital funds at all. And I organized, with others, a session on investment in small companies. And a group very similar to you all turned up. People from government, from investment institutions, entrepreneurs. And in those days, it was tough to explain what an entrepreneur was. For many of you who have less white hair than I have, it's hard to remember that, but that was the case. Entrepreneurship was considered to be a US phenomenon. Nobody really knew what it meant. And even several years later, in the early 80s, when venture capital funds had started to be raised, a venture capitalist friend of mine took his son to his new school. And the headmaster asked the son of this venture capitalist, "What does your father do, son?" And he said, "Oh, he's an adventure copulist." It's an absolutely true story. And it sums up exactly where we are today in the social investment space. Because in 1977, there were no UK funds. I raised, with my partners at Apax in 1981, the largest venture fund to date. It was £10 million. Apax raised 3 or 4 years ago £10 billion for its last fund. It was estimated in the early 80s, when that fund was raised in 1981, that about £30 million a year was being invested to back entrepreneurs in the UK, mainly by 3i. We reached the peak of £10 billion in the UK alone 2 or 3 years ago. And I think all of you have come here today because you sense that something major has changed, just as I sensed and the people in that room at the Grosvenor House sensed 30 years ago. The pressures on society that come from greater entrepreneurship, lower taxation to encourage entrepreneurship, and the higher rates of growth that are achieved lead to an increase in the average standard of living, but a huge divergence between people at both ends of the scale. And the issue of social cohesion needs to be addressed. And government has found it extremely difficult to address it, even in times of plenty, let alone in times when government budgets have got to be cut back. And so the issue is, how do you deal with the social consequences of our system? Because business and financial consequences are taken care of admirably by the system, as we can see by reading the newspapers every day. But social consequences are taken care of by government, and government can't cope. And most people have not cottoned on to the fact, all of you in this room, of course, know, because you're part of it, that between the private sector and the public sector, there is a large social sector. I'll call it the social sector, if you allow me, rather than the third sector, because it speaks for what it does. That social sector in the UK alone has about £95 billion of charitable foundation, charitable trust assets, and 800,000 full-time equivalent people working in it. Many of you here come from that sector. And yet what we discovered in the Social Investment Task Force was that the vast majority of those organizations, in my estimation, a good 3/4 of them, have less than 3 months' worth of financial visibility. So we have a huge sector with huge assets, completely undercapitalized. And so it becomes extremely difficult for a social entrepreneur to be able to address a social issue in the way in which a business entrepreneur could tackle a business opportunity. And what we've all been trying to do over the years is to try to connect these social entrepreneurs to the capital markets, so that the social entrepreneur who can achieve a performance of a reduction of 13% in reoffending, or in school dropout rates, or in homelessness, or in the elderly staying in their homes instead of moving out of them into government-funded properties, An entrepreneur seeking to achieve a social good in that way can have a 13% yield and raise capital from the capital markets, not from foundations and grants, but from foundations' balance sheets as an investment. And with that objective in mind, the team at Social Finance, over the last 3 years, with the help of others and inputs from many others, developed a social impact bond which does just that. For the first time, somebody achieving a positive social outcome, which is measurable in a reduction or an increase in something that is good, can pay out accordingly. And clearly, foundations, charitable foundations, by using their balance sheets, are going to be crucial in getting this movement going, just as pension funds were crucial to getting venture capital and private equity going. And in the venture capital world, when I started in 1981, was a very tall figure called Tom Judge. He came from the AT&T pension fund. And he soon became recognized as the leader among institutional investors backing venture capital, and people followed him. In a conversation I had with Tom 2 or 3 years later, 1984 or so, I said, "What is it, Tom, that got you to believe so much that this would work?" And he said, "You know, Ronald, there are certain things that involve an act of faith. I can see that this is going to work, it should work, and I have faith if I back the right people that it will work." And that's the stage we're at with social impact bonds today. It's a very powerful innovation. I've had meetings in the United States with governors of states, with the White House. They're very interested in it. I think somebody mentioned this morning the Obama administration's put $100 million in its budget for what they have called pay for success bonds. I was in Australia in December. The New South Wales government then announced that it wanted to issue social impact bonds if it gets re-elected, which I have to say seems unlikely according to the polls. They've put in an allocation of $25 million to them. In Israel, the government is talking about introducing them. In Canada, the Social Finance Task Force has recommended a slew of measures involving taxation and so on, which would really give a big push to the development of social investment. So what does it take now to turn social impact bonds into venture capital and to turn social entrepreneurs into what we've come to expect from business entrepreneurs? Well, you have to create a system. And the key components of the system are in this hall today. You would not have been able to do it without government acting boldly. It acted boldly first in the United States when the prudent man rule was redefined in 1978 to say that a prudent pension fund investor for a private sector pension fund would invest in venture capital. And if it didn't, it should explain why. Well, we hope that the Charity Commission in the UK will give a similar impetus to investment in social impact bonds and other innovative financial instruments that have social mission as their goal. Government had to help too. Government had to create vehicles that were user-friendly for investors. You had to bring the industry onshore in the mid-80s through the creation of limited partnerships. Government will need to do that. And government will need not to be pusillanimous in providing tax incentives. To give you a measure of just how little sometimes we in Britain emphasize these tax incentives and are prepared to let the money flow with them. If you compare community investment tax relief in this country, which has had about 60 million pounds approved under it, to the new markets tax incentives, which spawned it, the Social Investment Task Force was one of the main impeti, I suppose is the word, for introducing community investment tax relief. That 60 million pounds compares with $26 billion in the United States. And the debates that we're having in the UK about it is that there mustn't be demand for it since so little has gone out. But the 100% that has gone out in the United States has gone out 60% of it, of 26 billion, for transactions involving property in low-income neighborhoods, and 40% for personal finance of people living in poor neighborhoods. And both those things are restrictions for community investment tax relief. Government has to seize this initiative boldly. We want it to play an enabling role. We don't require more than that. Social entrepreneurs will do the rest. When it comes to the question of is there the capacity to absorb billions of pounds today of social impact bonds, say in the UK, the answer is clearly no. But at the same time, the chicken and the egg came at the same time. They did not succeed each other. There is no principle of one coming before the other. And in order to build the capacity of the sector, we have to make it easier for social entrepreneurs to raise finance. If you begin to get the money to flow, you will see social entrepreneurs within the sector ratcheting up their ambitions, and new social entrepreneurs coming in from other sectors to achieve social missions. The difference between 1977 and today is that this happens to be a British innovation. We have every incentive in this country, really, to put all our weight behind it. In the case of my first fund, in 1981, I had to go to the United States in order to raise capital to get it off the ground. Half of the money had to come from the United States, 10 million pounds. In this case, I hope we can together make history and have the world come to us in order to fund social impact bonds. Thank you very much.